This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. There is no shortage of talk about innovation in the aid and development space. But how much of this talk has actually moved beyond small-scale piloting programs into standard operations for funders and implementers? My unscientific read from the field continues to say not too much, especially in the case of large-scale implementers. Like any established system or process, fundamentally shifting the way business is done takes both time and unwavering leadership. The U.S. Global Development Lab at USAID seeks to be a mechanism for taking ideas to change-making action. As explained by Alexis Bonnell, my guest for the 124th Terms of Reference podcast, the lab seeks to be a catalyst for nothing less than the transformation of the development enterprise by opening development to people everywhere with good ideas, promoting new and deepening existing partnerships, bringing data and evidence to bear, and harnessing scientific and technological advances. Alexis is the division chief in applied innovation and acceleration for the lab. And as you've come to expect from TOR guests, she is definitely someone to listen to. She has developed and delivered over $1 billion worth of humanitarian and development programming in over 25 conflict, post-conflict, and emergency countries, in almost every sector from education to stabilization, for more than 30 international bilateral donors, 10 UN agencies, the military, and the private sector. I spoke with Alexis in Virginia. And hey, before we dive into the episode, if you like what you're hearing, take a moment to open up iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher or whatever your podcast app happens to be and click subscribe. Also consider giving the show a rating because it really does help. And finally, please consider sharing this episode or the podcast on Facebook or Twitter to help others get in on making aid and development better. Now on to the show with Alexis and the Global Development Lab. Hello, Alexis. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hey, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about talking to you today.
Like most of our guests on the show, you are a world traveler. Where do we find you sitting today?
Today, you find me in the mundane suburbia of Annandale, Virginia, where I live. But just because it's local doesn't mean it doesn't have its exotic sexiness.
And we're recording this in sort of late September of 2016. So does that mean it's hot and muggy, or it's crisp in August? It's crisp in like autumn, or?
No, we've taken a nice turn for a little bit of cool weather. Had a nice rain yesterday. So officially, I think people are thinking we have entered fall, but I have learned not to hold my breath on those things.
I'm sure that there's a lot of pumpkin everything around you.
There is. In fact, pumpkin spice lattes just hit the stands, and I am happy about it.
That is awesome. And everybody on the show know we recently relocated to Bangkok, my family, and so we are, we're only a couple of weeks. Oh, actually, we're about 6 weeks old in Bangkok. So we're starting to think of all of the things that we don't have from.
Oh, well, I will have a pumpkin latte for you.
Awesome. You are the division chief in applied innovation and acceleration at the U.S. Global Development Lab, which not only is an awesome sounding title, but it sounds like you get to have a fun job. Tell us what that means. What is it that you do? What's the U.S. Global Development Lab, and what's your focus specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as many of your, listeners and audience participants probably know, really, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, our mission is to end extreme poverty. And we're really at a unique point in history where we feel we have the opportunity to realize that. And I couldn't be more excited. I feel like I have one of the coolest gigs in development, really being focused on the innovation side. And the U.S. Global Development Lab, which is the entity that I sit within at USAID, really serves as an innovation hub for the agency. We tend to focus on taking smart risk, testing new ideas, and partnering with others both inside and outside of USAID to be able to harness, the power of the modern tools that are available to us today, to look at different approaches and kind of play with new actors to figure out how do we solve that extreme poverty challenge kind of better, faster, smarter, in concert and in kind of the complement with the rest of USAID's work.
Give us a specific example, like what's a way that you're taking a smart risk, or that you're testing, or that you're partnering to tackle some of these goals?
Absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite examples, and what's really kind of become quite popular in the last couple of years, is just this general theory around democratizing development. The way that we had traditionally solved development challenges was getting a bunch of really smart people in a room, technical experts, and figuring out the right approaches. And that obviously makes all the sense in the world. But something we found as we started doing things like ventures, challenges, prizes, was really the fact that sometimes we didn't actually know who was going to solve the issue. And so, when I first got exposed to grand challenges, it was on a grand challenge that our global health team was running called Saving Lives at Birth. And it was really looking at the question of how do you help, reduce the number of mothers and babies that die in the first 48 hours of birth. And so, that was kind of one of my first exposures to the idea that good ideas can come from anywhere. And one of my, long-term favorites is, a gentleman who had an idea around solving breech birth, and which of course is an issue that face, any woman of any location around the world. It's not just, something that folks in extreme poverty are facing. And so what was so powerful about that was that the gentleman who created the device was an Argentinian car mechanic. And it was really one of my first wake-up calls that, yes, we are doing amazing things with the traditional programming that we do in different sectors of development, but that we really needed to open our minds about who else might play a critical role in solving these challenges. And so I think that move to kind of democratizing, opening up, and tapping into the collective global genius through things like prizes, challenges, et cetera, and that open innovation approach really was a game changer for me.
So when you hold these as a hub, when you hold these prizes, challenges, et cetera, take us through the process of, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how do you get from recognizing a good idea to then handing that off into actual implementation, or, going from pilot to scale, those kinds of things?
Sure. So just starting off at the easy question. No problem. So I think first of all, we look at a couple of different approaches to innovation. So the way that I like to think about it sometimes is you have open innovation, and that's something that, for example, our development innovation ventures really look at. And that's the idea that, we're really open to any idea, anywhere, anytime. And I think what's important about that is those types of approaches really help surface issues and opportunities where USAID can potentially play a role in solving something, even if it may not be a front of mind issue for us. The second form of innovation, or most common form, is really that of directed innovation. And what I mean by that is like the Saving Lives at Birth Grand Challenge, or our recently open Securing Water for Food Grand Challenge. Those really look at trying to solve particular issues. So things like, how do we use less water and yet create more food? And I think, when you look at the approach, each of those have a slightly different frame. So for example, if you're looking at a directed innovation or a grand challenge, you're really asking yourselves, along with your partners, which I love. So one of the really critical things about grand challenges is that we never do them alone, right? One of the most important lessons I think that we've had over the last decade is that, we can't do this alone. We can't solve these intractable issues. So whether it's the private sector, Silicon Valley, students, that we really have to create a mechanism that allows us to convene versus control. And that's been really critical. So to get to the nitty gritty, in a grand challenge as an example, we might come together with a number of partners and say, what is the problem we're really trying to solve? And it's critical for us to not be prescriptive about what the solution might be, but to say, solutions that address, this particular issue. And the example I gave, using less water, but creating more food. And then we open that up to the world. So we really welcome ideas, again, from, someone who might be facing that issue in Kenya, from implementer that may already be working with us, from a student, from someone who's never heard of USAID before. And that's always really exciting about the challenge approach or the venture approach, because oftentimes, usually 70% or more of the people that engage challenges with us may never have worked with USAID before. So it's a really proven way of us engaging, folks that are maybe not within the normal cohort. So after that, we get a bunch of applications. We usually use a diverse set of kind of judging criteria to really figure out what has the best potential. And things we look at that we really value are things like evidence, right? So if someone's coming in with a proposal that has a lot of evidence and a lot of good logic as to why this might be something worthwhile to approach, it's going to usually score higher than something that may not have that. We usually collect, those winners. We'll go back and forth and do a bit of due diligence to make sure that, this is a legitimate entity and, kind of meets other factors right criteria. And then hopefully we end up awarding funds to some of those applicants. Once we award, each program is a little bit different, and each program is a little bit different even in the nuances. I'm trying to give a blanket overview. So for some programs, for example, like our Securing Water for Food Grant Challenge, when someone wins, not only do they win, the grant money, but they actually get engaged in kind of a series of performance measures, gate stages. But more importantly, they're actually provided with additional business assistance. Because one of the things we've really learned, unfortunately, is that sometimes simply providing grant money does not mean instant success and scale, right? A lot of these innovators or entrepreneurs face the same business barriers that anyone else trying to start up a business would face.
And a lot of times the person who comes up with the idea, they may not be a great business person.
And that's exactly true, right? It could be a talent issue, marketing issue, customer demand. And so we try to understand that there's more to it, more to making this innovation have impact in the ecosystem than just money. And so a lot of our work actually goes into not only how can we be helpful to that entrepreneur, but more importantly, how do we then start to do what we call the application of innovation? How do we get that innovation used by, for example, someone who's already doing some project work in that area for USAID in Kenya? And so we really believe that the magic happens not only in the discovery and, that the hero is the innovator is an incredible hero in the process, but even more so the idea of getting that innovation used. And for those folks in development who are really willing to evolve their approaches to include and embrace these innovations are really true heroes as well.
That was the most complete answer I think I've ever heard on this program.
Sorry.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for being just so concise on that. You gave the example of the Argentinian auto mechanic, who developed a device. What's maybe that is your favorite one that you pull out, but do you have an example of one or two of the awardees that you've had in recent times where you just think, wow, this is something we completely didn't expect and it came from, and yet you think it's a real game changer?
Oh goodness, Stephen, it's like asking me which of my children are my favorite, right?
We all have to make choices. I
know, right? So if there's a lifeboat and there was only one, now I think, I'll give you a couple of quick examples because I think they represent different things about what I'm passionate about. So one, for example, is an innovation that we funded through our development innovation ventures called Zusha. And Zusha was, I think what was so important about it to me is that it was one of these innovations that happened to be in an area of kind of focus that really wasn't something that USAID was paying a tremendous amount of attention to. And that was the idea of car accidents. And what was interesting in the application is it actually made the case and provided evidence to us that, more people die from car accidents, for example, in Nairobi every year than all three of our health issues combined. And so it was really interesting to have something to recognize that there was something that was really impacting people's lives, but that for whatever reason, USA didn't have a lot of current programming around. And so Zusha was an opportunity for us to really make a small investment in an area, in reducing traffic accidents. And I believe, and I'll have to go back and check my numbers, but I believe that we saw something like a 60% reduction in auto mortality in the control group in the first year. And A, those are just numbers you can't ignore. And B, all of this was done through a sticker. And
I was just going to say, what was the mechanism? Yeah.
It was really, if you think about, living in a place like the States or in Europe, you might be driving behind a trucker and you'd see that kind of, if I'm driving badly, report me or things like that. And so there was actually a lot of evidence, in our kind of daily lives and how we live that this might work, right? And so, the innovators really brought this and said, we believe that doing something similar, putting a sticker into a local transport that says, you deserve a safe ride, report, something if they're not driving safe, et cetera. We've seen that work in the US. So let's try to, to iterate on that and to use that in a different context. And so that's one, I think, where I just get really excited when something like open innovation can open our eyes to how easy it is, to have impact and something that we really weren't prioritizing and for, literally pennies of investment.
I think this is the part of the innovation conversation that I wonder if you have insight into or whatever, because you mentioned this is a place where aid and the implementing partners, et cetera, you just weren't paying attention. Or maybe they were paying attention, but nothing was being directed there. How does that translate now? Is there a directive that says, hey, implementing partners, you should probably look at this? Or how does it creep into the system, the aid offices out there in the world and then the implementing partners about the types of programs that they can put on the table?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. And I think one of the things that's changed for me is coming into development many, many years ago, there was always this kind of operating principle that, development was like the sun and everything like went around it. And what I'm finding now is that, for something like Zusha, it may actually make all the sense in the world for it to not be us who scale that. And as an example, if you think about the entity that's most incented for a reduction in traffic accidents in Kenya, it's actually the insurance companies. And what's been really exciting is that they've really been paying attention to this. And so scale, we've had to learn. In some ways, we've had to give up that control, right, and embrace that convening. Because if scale happens because, insurance companies really embrace this, then that's just as much a success as whether or not, it perforated, I think, that the standard industry, development industry. But I can give you an example of another innovation that I really love that actually came through our Securing Water for Food Grant Challenge called Ignitia. And Ignitia is super cool. I did not know this, and maybe you did, Stephen, which means you know much more than I do, which I'm sure is the case. But it's actually quite hard to predict the weather equator. And no one's really come up until this point with a good algorithm that, could be dependably used. And if you think about that, that has massive impact around the idea of farming, right? Farmers being able to predict, is it going to rain? Is it not? And so, Ignitia is something where an organization came up with this algorithm. It seems to be really, really dependable. And, what was interesting about the model is that, of course, USAID has a tremendous amount of food security programming that exists now, right? Where we're already working with farmers capacity building programs, et cetera. So one of the things that's been really exciting about this innovation is as it's been kind of socialized with different implementers who may already be doing farmer capacity programs on behalf of USAID or others in the industry, kind of as they become aware of this, saying, oh, this is something we can easily wrap into our offerings that really does have, a direct impact in farming outcomes. And so I think, a big part of what one of the challenges is this idea of socialization, right? Knowing what's out there. And one of the things that we did to start to try to tackle this is, along with about 100 other players in development, created this global innovation exchange. And the concept was that we're all doing amazing work in innovation, but there was no single place to see what was out there. And so the exchange was really created both from an innovation as well as a resource standpoint for someone, for example, like an implementer who is working in farming or energy or agriculture, to be able to look and see not only what exists, but what might be already being tested in their country, created locally, et cetera. So that's something we're really excited about, just bringing that almost business intelligence. And I feel like you don't hear that term very often in development.
I can already hear people gasping,
I know.
as they're listening to it, because this is like an actual attempt at coordination, right? And I'm not going to be the jaded consultant, international development professional that most people are. But that is one of the sort of the follow-ups that I was just thinking was, how does, when you were giving the example of Zusha, and then you're bringing in the insurance industry, how does aid as an organization, one of its big branding messages is, hey, from the American people. Is there now a shift in culture that you've seen? Like we're able to give that up kind of thing?
I think, what we deliver, we certainly want the American people to be able to take an incredible amount of pride in, in the generosity, in the, in the desire.
Sure. I mean, we're definitely investing. We're contributing, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think at the same time, I think, most people understand that if someone tells you that they're good at everything, as you probably know, Stephen, they're good at nothing, right? And so I think one of the things that we've really tried to do is understand the power of partnerships. And I like to call it kind of the special sauce principle, right? So I think there are going to be things that USAID and people in the development industry are really good at. And then there's going to be things that, really the advantage lies with another player. And I think what we have to do to be good and to be responsible to the American taxpayer is, as efficiently as possible, make that handover make sense, right? So one example that I love to use, and, we're exploring more and more about how we can be, kind of make this ecosystem robust. But, USAID, we are in a great place, along with Gates Foundation and many other entities, to potentially be discovering and funding innovation. And yet, when you think about really the idea of the demand side, so that's the supply side of innovation. When you think about the demand side, whether it's our implementers, whether it is local ministry officials, whether it's a Peace Corps volunteer, that's really the representation of the demand and use side. And so what's critical is that as this innovation is being made available, that demand side, so whether it's a Peace Corps volunteer says, you know what, let me take that, let me try that, in my community. And most importantly, let me give feedback about whether or not this worked or how it can work better. And I think, one of our big points of responsibility is to understand where and what players are best suited to kind of take, that role in the moment of the ecosystem at that moment in time.
If I'm either an implementing partner, or I'm somebody who's sitting in Ghana right now, or I'm another development agency, and I go to the Global Innovation Exchange, am I going to be overwhelmed? Where my real sort of foundation for my question is, it sounds like, it's so easy to have these projects popping up everywhere across all of the different industries, et cetera. And how do we protect against that overwhelm?
Well, I think the question is really, is it bad? Meaning that having a lot of options. So I'll give you an example in my personal life. It's interesting because I love to buy things, for example, on Amazon. And when I go to Amazon, part of what I like is the fact that, and I believe this is the literal number, when I went to buy a device to help me rake up leaves in my front yard, I put up, lawn rake, and I had 1,800 options that came back. And
that's
then
fantastic.
kind of,
I want to acknowledge that that's fantastic.
Right. So putting on my customer hat, and this is, I think, one of the most critical, switches in the industry. Putting on my hat as a customer, I like having options, right? I'm also overwhelmed. And so I look for things like, different elements of business intelligence that help me make a decision based on my values. So for example, that could be a review. It could be the number of something purchased. And what we found in this innovation kind of evolution is that each customer, each user really has a different paradigm about what works for them. And there's one thing I can guarantee you, Stephen, if there was a pop-up that came on Amazon and told me, you shall use this rake, I would probably be a little pissed, right? Because,
sure.
Who are you to tell me, which rake I use? I come here because I want options. So I think the answer is yes, it can be overwhelming. But I also think that as, technical experts and as people that are really trying to deliver development, it's part of, the onus and the expectation that we should know what our options are out there. And more importantly, we should respect and develop what our value prospects are and how we evaluate those. So for some people looking at an innovation, the fact that it's been used in a country next to theirs is going to mean a lot. For others, it may simply come down to, has there been a randomized control trial, right? What is the evidence? And for others, it might be, is there a user review? Is there someone I can talk to who's used this? Mm-hmm. And so what we've tried to do is recognize that we really are trying to move away from the concept generally of beneficiary and to the idea of an empowered customer. And whether that customer is an implementer, a Ministry of Health official, a woman in a village, this idea of having options and being empowered to exercise, and to see what those are, to exercise and select what is the best fit is really where we think, we're hoping development is headed.
I mean, you've just described, a real market for innovation, right? I mean, yeah. At the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is a cultural shift for us, right? We have to, as development professionals, we have to be willing to kind of evolve our approach, as an industry to kind of say, to have that hunger and that appetite that there might be something different, there might be something new. And I think what's critical about that is some of it won't be good stuff, right? Some of it won't work or won't be appropriate. And we have to be just as willing to share that information, share that business intelligence to inform each other. But I think we also have to understand that what ultimately works for me, or that what I choose to scale in my country or my application, may be slightly different from what works, a region over, and that's okay. The point is really the focus of solving it.
Right, and I'm even thinking of even a wider palette of colors when you think of that market. There's the cheap plastic alternative. Yeah. There's the really sturdy cement alternative. There's all the different flavors in between, and ultimately where my brain goes is that it's messy, and just when you go to a marketplace like Amazon, or you go to a marketplace anywhere in the United States, or I go to a marketplace in central Bangkok, not only is it buyer beware, but it's also buyer have power to be able to disseminate and sort of filter through what you're being presented.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is where the idea of smart risk comes in, right? I mean, we believe in smart risk, kind of rigorous testing, these tools and approaches. But what that also comes down to is sharing information, right? Valuing that business intelligence, being intentional. So sometimes, when we'll talk, for example, to a particular implementer about trialing an innovation, we don't say, hey, this is the best thing ever. It slices, it dices. We say, this seems to have evidence that it might be something that you really want to consider, you want to look at. You're the expert, you're on the hook for delivering this project. Help us understand, be a partner to, determining if this is a better way, of going about, the project or the program that you're doing. And sometimes that comes back and says, what? It would be really great, except for X, Y, and Z. And those are actually tweaks we can make, right? And I think that whole drive toward the potential of adaptive programming, of iterating, not necessarily looking at a development program that's for 5 years and really thinking that you've designed something perfect from day one, but rather designing it in a way where, 6 months later, when a new tech enters the field or a new partner, could be a player, being able to iterate and adapt that program that you're delivering to be able to embrace those types of things and evolve, I think is going to be the true test of, who the main players are in 5 to 10 years from now.
Let me ask you about maybe potentially a tough question then. I make my daily wage being an evaluator, being a monitoring evaluation expert in the business. And we know that one of the most difficult aspects, as you were just describing, on that 5-year program that just got awarded or that IDIQ that just went out, there isn't a culture of adjustment that is yet percolated through. Are you finding that you are either at the spearhead of that, or do you feel that there's a real leadership uptake to say, hey, look, we're going to award this to you, but you got to be adaptable. You got to, and we're also willing to be that funding partner that walks through that process with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been so impressed by my colleagues at AID. I mean, across the agency and industry generally, we have a number of different donor partners where we're really engaged in these conversations. How do we collectively, as large donors, make our programs more agile? We have some amazing work being done by our policy planning and learning team and other kind of segments across USAID that are really specifically tackling this. And I think that there are elements of, that we can take notes from, whether it's kind of the agile Scrum approach that's often been used in Silicon Valley in different projects. But there's also, maybe just some not as sexy stuff, some procurement changes or some shifts that really provide that type of flexibility, to our partners, that really make them feel like they can make those safe adaptations. And, I think that this will also change a little bit of reflecting on what we need from a talent standpoint in development. Obviously, we're always going to have a need for strong technical expertise, but, the idea of what our project managers may look like in the future, or what, the idea of valuing integrators and people who really specialize in compounded partnerships may start to evolve as really interesting skill sets that maybe didn't have as much of a role to play in earlier development history.
So take me down that future path for your organization, for the Development Lab, and how you're interacting, what you're looking at. Right now, you run challenges, you run these sort of prize applications, you're integrating with partners. Is there something that you see coming down the pipe in the next 3 or 4 years that is going to alter the way that you're working, or shifting how you're applying innovation?
Oh, goodness. So many answers to that question. I think that literally that answer changes on a weekly basis because there's so many exciting things happening. I mean, I think the role, for example, of entrepreneurs, the private sector, the emerging impact investing market. I just got back from SOCAP in San Francisco, which is a big conference around that. And I think one of the things that is so exciting, but really, we've got to come to grips with, is that development is not just a more popular sport. We like to say that, innovation is a contact sport, but, development used to be kind of that thing over there that a group of us in development did. And really now you have such an incredible purpose-driven generation, not just in the US, but around the world, where both companies and people want what they do to matter. And I think this is an unprecedented opportunity about how development as an industry is going to leverage these new players, these new minds, these new resources. So I think, in the coming years, those entities that do that really well, that understand their special sauce, that welcome, the special sauce of other organizations, are going to be some of the true game changers. I think, the other thing that both keeps me up at night, as well as just is the most exciting part of the future of the next 10 years for me, is this idea of the shift from beneficiary to customer. To give you a living example of that, in the last 30 years, our value proposition was very much, as an industry, was very much based on the idea of having an entity that could help interpret what a community really needed, right? And communicating that back and designing programming, et cetera. And we didn't have the tools really for the direct relationship with customers that we do now. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how should this be changing how we do development? And as an example, what I mean by that is there's a woman in a village right now with a cell phone. That woman most likely didn't have a cell phone 5 years ago, 10 years ago. If that woman took that cell phone and had your number, Stephen, or my number, she could call us or text us and say, I don't want this type of development support. I need clean water, right? Or they could opt in for, whatever really was their heartfelt need. And I think that that's a big game changer, because all of a sudden the idea of the middle man, the middle woman, the middle organization, starts to become questionable as a value proposition. And so I think what's exciting about that is we now have ways to really hear directly from the customer, to close the loop on whether or not what we're delivering is valuable. Mm-hmm. As an example, when we put something out like a cook stove in the field, technology exists now for us to actually use real-time sensors to say, are they being used? Right. And I think this element of almost accountable innovation, or the application of innovation, and closing the loop and empowering the customer voice to really let demand, lead where development is going, to me is kind of the North Star and what gets me out of bed every day.
I was lucky enough to participate in a project with the U report system from UNICEF. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but that, you're essentially describing that system where it's citizen, they say it's citizen-driven development, right, or citizen-driven demand, and I'm very interested to see how that continues to play out through and buy-in from the establishment, right? Because if you're taking the power structure away from the establishment, it's a conversation to continue, right?
Yeah, well, and I think it's interesting because, and I think there's a bit of truth to this, but when you start getting into this conversation in a really deep way, and people realize that we're really serious about this, right? We really do want to empower, our customers. Then at some point, someone always says, but they don't know what they need, right? They don't know what's good for them. And I think it's interesting looking at our own lives and kind of, what the sharing economy or the custom economy that we live in now, this idea of, okay, well, in the instance where I may not know exactly what I want or need, right? What internet connection or bandwidth or provider is best for me, then part of the idea is how do we then shift to both the education, advocacy, marketing, and almost salesmanship that we as customers have come to expect in our own daily lives. And this has been a hot topic of, I think, both debate, but almost like not really debate, in the sense that, development hasn't been comfortable really with the concept of selling things, right? We don't like to think of ourselves as selling things. We like to think of ourselves, as helping people, which, while absolutely true, so much of development programming in the coming years will also be about behavior change, behavior science, and kind of respecting and understanding the customer. And I'm excited to see what that does in the sense of shifting how we program and how we really think about our work.
I think Dan Pink has a future as a consultant.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting as well. I don't know if this is just going to be a comment or a question, but yeah, I was again fortunate enough to teach a class here at a local university in Washington, D.C. recently, and I was kind of shocked because this is a development class. This is a university that puts people into the aid and development space, and a couple of the students said, hey, over my first couple of semesters, as I've looked at aid and how it's been put out there, I actually made the choice to go into public policy, or I made the choice to go into a different area because it seemed so broken. So how much of your role, or how much do you think the future of the lab and organizations like USAID is telling that new message, communicating that, and selling the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in many ways is what we would consider, the essence of our DNA. What I'll tell you is I'm encouraged because by no means are we alone, right? I mean, we have amazing leaders in our, global health, food security, democracy, other branches where they really understand and are leading, some of the evolution in these areas. So I think the lab, we kind of have a 3-part model. And on one hand, we look to do what we call disrupt. And that is really, what is the area outside of kind of the normal everyday purview of the business and activities that USAID is typically engaged with, that we can be pushing the envelope, that we can really be testing and trying models. Then our goal is when we find something that works, so for example, the Grand Challenge model as an approach, we then really try to bring it inside the agency, support it, get it tested, and get it to be adopted as part of one of the options in which USAID can do business, right? And the final one is the idea of mainstreaming. And so when we really realize this is super smart, this is good business, how do we actually use the power, the convening and catalyzing power of USAID to influence the rest of the industry to adopt this? And so, I think that it's kind of exciting times ahead. I also think that it's something where I know for myself, I had to go on a little bit of a personal journey where, sometimes when you reach a certain level of success in your career, you really like maintaining status quo, right?
Sure,
it's like, okay, how it is
now you've got the house, now you've got the kid.
Yeah, it's like, okay, how it is now is good, right? Like no one needs to change anything. I've got this down. I've got it locked. And I really had to find part of my own personal journey, this idea of finding my value in the evolution, right? And understanding and embracing change and figuring out how that change actually reinforced my value and what I had to offer versus taking away from that. And I think that as an industry in general, that's something at an organizational level, at an industry level, but most importantly at an individual level that we really have to ask ourselves is, on any given day, am I about controlling this or am I about convening, catalyzing this? And, I think, day to day that can become more or less of a challenge.
I know that you've mentioned this over the last half hour here in a couple of different places, but maybe just to sort of consolidate it, what stifles innovation? Or what have you seen, through the lens of the lab that has stifled it in places of the world?
It's a good question. I think that change is always hard, and in many cases, when you talk about innovation and iteration and adaptation, you're talking about introducing elements of evolution and change. I think, the way I typically look at it is pretty straightforward. I think that there are cultural barriers, right? So whether or not a person or a sector or an industry or market is kind of ready, for that, and how you might actually consciously create kind of a cultural change management process. I think there's also the bureaucracy. So, we have teams that are actually looking at, as I mentioned, how do you procure differently? What are the legal frameworks that we might change in order to make it easier to participate in development in these evolving complementary ways? And then I think, at the other end of it, it's kind of like project management design, right? What should a modern development project look like? Who should it involve? What should it be looking to accomplish both in short term and long term? So by no means are we free of challenges and barriers, but I do think that when you break them out in those kind of, bite-size approachable pieces, you really do find that there are some clear solutions. And then I think that the goal is to, bring them back into kind of making the Lego, if you will, that ultimately takes shape. But I found that if you look at it, it's too complex. There's so many moving pieces, there's all that. It can be really overwhelming. But if you actually step back and kind of take each one of those in their own right, they are totally solvable.
Sure. I just, in my mind, what was kind of exploding while you were talking just then is even the process of the procurement of a large body like a government or a school system or, any sort of large institution, they're making decisions that they want to make once every 5 years.
Yeah.
And so
and that's because procurement's hard.
Yeah,
right?
When you're talking about
it's not fun, it's hard.
Yeah, when you're talking about disrupting procurement, that is such an interesting conversation. I mean, I feel like there's probably a whole conversation we can have on that.
And I can actually blow your mind really quickly on that one. So this is going to tell you how serious we are about convening and partnering. I have a team that actually is looking specifically at the applied innovation, how we help make it more attractive and easy for implementers, for example, to use innovation. And a lot of that has come down to procurement. And so we've actually gone out to those implementing partners and actually said, what do you want the language to say? Like if you could write what, a procurement or something like that would say, that would make you feel empowered and competitively advantaged to use innovation, et cetera, what would that be? And that's a real change for us, right? Not kind of determining here's what it is, but actually going and saying, you're the entities that we really want to see take this up. what is it? You tell us what this has to be in order to incentivize you.
Man, I hope you send me that email.
I
So just a few more questions, one a bit longer, but then two that I usually end each of these conversations with. The first one is there, and the answer may just be no at this stage, but is there something that's either come out of the lab or one of the processes that you guys partner on that has now taken hold? It's now a part of the standard operation of either USAID or another funding mechanism, or something that an implementing partner is just doing now that it's just a standard op?
Oh, goodness. I mean, there's so many, whether it's the digital development principles, whether it's, the exchange went from nothing to having over 4,500 innovations on it. I mean, in what felt like the blink of an eye, over $200 million is available. Also seen changes that have already happened in our procurement guidelines. I think we've started to see the consolidation of new mechanisms. So, for example, what we call the BAA, which allows us to co-create, has become an approach that has been used by others in the agency. And really just even the models of things like prizes and challenges. We've been so excited just to see the incredible leadership across the agency around using that challenge and prize model. And these are not necessarily challenges that the lab is running. These are challenges, for example, the wildlife trafficking challenge, the powering agriculture challenge. These are really led by our colleagues, in those bureaus who just recognize that having a way to supplement that kind of open ingenuity along with their technical expertise is just smart business.
Thank you. It's just already a laundry list of cool things to check out. So the last two questions I have, these are two questions I ask every guest on the show. You are lucky enough to be in a position where you are constantly being fed with new information. So that's one thing. But where do you look specifically? Do you have podcasts you listen to, blogs you pay attention to, publications you read that you would point others who are listening to the show to say, hey, this is a great place to look?
I am so lucky because I have a lot of people who know just what my limitations are and are so generous with sending me stuff. So I would say that, of course, I'm a big fan of so many of the, the popular innovation books. I really look at a lot of our partners' work. So I'm in constant conversation with whether it's Australia, South Korea, Canada, DFID, et cetera, to kind of understand there's a real community network around that. I think from, reading standpoint, it's kind of like everything. So it's hard. I feel like that's not a good example. I have been spending a lot of time in the exchange lately, just because every day I see new things or new approaches. So I would say a lot of my time has been, around that. I, of course, if people aren't aware, the lab puts out an amazing kind of weekly newsletter that tackles and touches on some of the newer innovations, different things that are happening. So I would certainly recommend, our lab links as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure to link people to that newsletter as well. The last question, I'm trying to figure out how to rephrase it, because usually ask, what innovation outside your day-to-day life are you most excited about? But you're sort of, you have such a broad spectrum of things that you're. Is there anything that's a complete outlier that has not even hit the innovation exchange, or is there something out there that you think is the next game changer that just really hasn't been brought into the system yet?
I'll give you a category. So I'm really excited, and I'm not a fintech specialist, but I'm really excited about what things like blockchain might mean as far as digital identity and what digital identity, digital finance, how that whole world is kind of coming together and what that might allow us to leapfrog in development. The other thing, I use a personal app, which you may or may not have heard of just in my daily life, called Nextdoor. And Nextdoor is, in essence, a community app. So it's literally kind of an online app where the people who live around you interact, engage, and kind of live your daily lives more connected. And I think there's a real interesting element about, as people in the developing world have devices, are able to connect, are able to share information, I just wonder what the value proposition is going to have to be, both inside that community and even outside that community, to see how they might work together, how they might be more effective within their own community structure. And that's just me reflecting on the fact that when my dog goes missing, instantly our success rate of finding lost, animals in our neighborhood is 100% now, because instantly someone knows. And so it just strikes me, what does building, creating, and connecting community at the developing world, in developing world villages, et cetera, what does that actually mean, and what shape will that take in the future?
Alexis, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your time
thanks
today.
so much, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.